Hello, everybody, and welcome to the Radical Candor podcast. I'm Kim Scott, co-founder of Radical Candor and author of Radical Candor and Just Work.
I'm Amy Sandler, your host for the Radical Candor podcast. And today we are so excited to welcome Amy Edmondson to our second Radically Candid Conversation episode of 2023. Amy C. Edmondson is the Novartis Professor of Leadership and Management at the Harvard Business School. She's the author of several books, including The Fearless Organization, Creating Psychological Safety in the Workplace for Learning, Innovation, and Growth, and a new book called Right Kind of Wrong, The Science of Failing Well, available September 5th. And according to Publishers Weekly, this is a book, quote, perfectionists will find freeing, which means that I am snuggling up to it every night for the rest of my life. Amy Edmondson from Amy Sandler and the whole Radical Candor team, we are so thrilled to have you on our show today.
Thank you. I'm thrilled to be here.
Yeah, Kim, I know that you have done some work with Amy. Do you want to share a little bit about your collaboration to date before we jump in?
Sure. So Amy and I recently wrote an article together about how people sort of misunderstand radical candor and psychological safety in ways that are sort of very different but related. So Amy, tell me if I get this wrong, but it is my perception that people often interpret radical candor as being mean, and they interpret psychological safety as, saying everything in a mean way, but they interpret psychological safety as saying nothing as a way of being nice. And neither one is accurate. So why don't you correct the misinterpretation of psychological safety first, and then I'll take on radical candor.
Yeah. Psychological safety is not about being nice. And as you just said, it's the problem is being nice is often code for don't say what you really think. Whereas psychological safety is all about, it describes an environment which you can say what you really think.
Yes.
It doesn't mean it's easy, right? Because I think, honestly, that would be unrealistic. It's never going to be easy to, ask a question when you're in over your head, or share a mistake you've just made, or disagree with the boss on something. It's never going to be easy. But psychological safety describes an environment where you believe that's welcome, that's accepted, that's what we do around here.
Yeah, absolutely. So it's not always comfortable. In fact, it's often uncomfortable. Part of a psychologically safe environment is one in which people are able to move, and in fact, maybe pushed to move through the discomfort. Like the only way out is through.
My younger son had a teacher in sixth grade who said, "You've got to be comfortable being uncomfortable." And I thought, yes, that's the phrase.
That is it.
That's it. Psychological safety is about, and by the way, collectively, right? Like we can talk about it. It's discussable. This isn't easy, but it's what we have to do because of what's at stake, because we care.
Yeah. And I think with radical candor, people sometimes think that it means that you're saying the thing in the harshest possible way, which I would say is not radical candor. That's obnoxious aggression, right? And in fact,
candor.
Brutal honesty. And in fact, there was someone wrote into me recently, and you and I had kind of an exchange about this, where her boss told her that her high standards were getting in the way of psychological safety. And you and I both, I think, had the same wince for the same reason. And so I wrote her something back, and she said the thing that I said to her that resonated for her was, taking the time to build these relationships is part of having high standards. It doesn't compromise them, right? And that's what she needed to explain to her boss and to herself. I don't know. What do you think about that?
I think that's right. And probably, to the boss's credit, he probably was trying to say,
or she, it could have been a woman. I'm going to raise the purple.
I thought I heard a he, but you're right. Maybe I didn't. So
I probably said he, but
I think
we were both making.
Doesn't matter.
Yep.
We'll rewind the tape.
Yeah, let's rewind the tape on that one. To the boss's credit, they might have been saying, there's a way in which you are either giving feedback or holding people to account that isn't helping them, right? That isn't helping them learn, and grow and do the best possible work. Or at least that's what the ideal, manager might be noticing in a subordinate. So holding high standards neither means you do or don't have psychological safety, and possibly the way you're communicating that could be getting in the way.
Yeah. But certainly the whole goal of psychological safety is to be able to have high standards and to do our best work. Like, that's the point, not to lower. If you're lowering standards in order to achieve psychological safety, you're not understanding psychological safety.
Exactly. I mean, I would have been better off calling it an environment where learning is possible, but that might not have caught on. Yeah.
It wouldn't be in the vocab, and I would have been better off calling it compassionate candor, but I wouldn't have sold as many books.
So here we are talking about an environment where learning is possible and compassionate candor, aka psychological safety, radical candor. Before we move on to your new book, Amy, I wanted to hear in your own words a quote I found really interesting about psychological safety, that it's felt permission for candor. In your own words, what do you mean by felt permission?
It's a wonderful question. And this was something I sort of came to over the years in trying to convey, what I mean and what I don't mean by this notion of psychological safety. And felt is that I internally believe I have permission. I have permission in this group, in this workplace, on this project. I believe I have been given permission for candor. It doesn't mean I find it easy or fun, but I do believe it's expected and allowed.
Yeah. Well, it's so interesting because we will often say that radical candor is measured not at the speaker's mouth, but at the listener's ear. Would you say that psychological safety, that sort of felt permission or that felt belief, is measured individual, even though it's a collective feeling? I might feel psychological safety in one group, but you might not.
Yes. I think that's a really important point. It is experienced as an individual, but it is an individual's sizing up of the context. And it is absolutely possible, in fact, probable, that different people in the same context will have different perceptions of how safe it is to speak up. And in a large enough data set, we will find far more consistent within a group, perceptions to be more consistent within a group and different between groups. So in other words, we could, the three of us could have real differences, but we're probably going to be more similar to each other than some random other group.
Yeah. And I think the thing that's so interesting about felt is that it kind of puts the onus on the leaders to prove that people can feel a particular way, and that everyone, not just some people, can feel psychologically safe. Because very often there's going to be discrepancies depending on who you are, whether you feel psychologically safe in the same group. And I think that can be bewildering to leaders until they realize it's their job to prove that it's safe to everyone.
I think that's right. And that also, the way you just put that makes it clear that it's a kind of emergent property of a group, but it's both, it's created by the sense makers and by the behaviors that especially a manager or a team leader, but behaviors that everybody is exhibiting. It's kind of co-created and co-perceived, but there will be differences. And one of the things that has most sort of shifted in my thinking about psychological safety over the past few years is this exact issue, which is that you can't just dismiss the differences that people from different groups. I used to sort of say, well, statistically we're close enough, but no. I mean, I think the last few years has really made clear that there can be systematic differences based on your background, your identity group, and the kinds of experiences that you have had in your own personal history.
Yeah. What one of the things this is bringing up for me is one of my favorite set of cases at Harvard Business School was about Johnson and Johnson and the Credo. And the original Credo read, I'm going to mar the language. I haven't memorized it, but basically there will be a system for employees to file complaints or basically a system for whistleblowing if there's ever a safety. And then they changed it to employees should feel comfortable telling us, and unless you build, and of course they didn't. And then there were some problems. It's really interesting. Like as a leader, it's your job to build the systems that reward, people for saying the thing that's hard to say.
I sure wonder why they changed it, because it would seem, if anything, you'd expect an evolution to go in the other direction. Because
I think
leaders
didn't like the whistleblowing.
I think the more we know about the psychology of voice, the more we realize you need systems in place to help, to enable.
Yeah.
Well, that's a wonderful segue into your newest book, Amy E., Right Kind of Wrong. And you explore another often misunderstood topic, which is failure, and also the systems that might contribute to failure. And this one is near and dear to my heart. And the question is, why is learning to fail well so important?
Learning to fail well is important because we live in an uncertain, complex world where, the future will be fraught with new challenges, new opportunities that will not announce themselves with instruction manuals. We will have to stumble and trip in order to discover them, as we always have. But I think, if anything, that need is greater than ever. So we all have to learn how to be comfortable with failing, especially failing forward, those sort of wrong paths taken in an earnest effort to find the right path.
Yeah, I think that is so well said. It reminds me, I had a mentor once who said that there can be a thin line between success and failure. And as it turns out, there's also, you can succeed or fail at failure. And the more we're able to learn by doing, to learn by making mistakes, especially in a world that is changing all the time, I think the more successful we'll be.
Yes, and I think there are two big, very different ways to fail at failure. And in one way is to not do your homework, right? To not do the background work or the failure proofing that could have been done to prevent certain kinds of preventable failures. And the other kind, which is totally different, is to fail to take enough risks to experience, as one must for, a full and adventurous life, all of the things that can go wrong in new territory.
Yeah, if you're not failing often enough, then you're not trying enough new things.
Right. Exactly. You're trying hard enough at the old things. I mean, to keep stretching your abilities.
One of the things that I really admire about the stories you tell in both of your books is how hard it was for you to come to grips with. You had this hypothesis and the data didn't back up your hypothesis. And you and I had a funny email exchange that I want to share with other folks, because somehow I had this naive view of scientists as these people who don't have the same emotions that the rest of us, and that you'd be equally happy when your hypothesis was proven or disproven. So talk a little bit about what it was like to come to grips with the fact that the data was surprising you and why that was so important to come to grips with.
I think all scientists would far prefer to be right than wrong. Let's just start there, right? So you do your homework, you've read the literature, you have formulated a hypothesis. In fact, you can have a fairly high degree of confidence that it's right, that the data are likely to support that hypothesis. And guess what? You can still be wrong. And like any human being, I promise you will be disappointed. I promise you they're disappointed. But what's different about scientists, at least good scientists, is that they know not to be crippled by it, but they don't waste time sort of wishing it were otherwise and were wallowing in a sense of shame about it. They understand that, disappointing though it was, it's valuable new information that allows them to make an even better hypothesis next time. And, they can relish the possibility that they're right now, at this point in time, the only person who knows that. right? They're the only person who has made that discovery of a path that didn't work. And if they've made it before anyone else, then they can make that next hypothesis before anyone else, and maybe that one will be right, and they can publish in a important journal.
Yeah. I wonder if there's a way to create systems that celebrate the right kind of wrong as well as the right kind of right, because one of the things that I have found that was really important when I was managing a big team at Google is celebrating the wrong, celebrating the failure, like turning it into a game. And obviously, you don't want to celebrate, sloppy mistakes, but helping people not just get comfortable with failure, but get rewarded for the right kinds of failures was, I think, really important to creating that idealized state that, not that I created it, but to taking a step in the direction of that idealized state where people are just happy to know the truth. And if they're right or they're wrong, either way they win because they learned something.
Right. I think it's really important. And when you get it right, the world celebrates you, right? The publication or the product or, the C-level executives, right? The external folks give you a round of applause. But when you get it wrong, that doesn't happen. So that means the team has to compensate. The team has to give you that love because, it's like a compensatory mechanism. Like, let's celebrate this failure for the new information it brought, and then let's quickly try the next thing. So I do think there's an internal, external distinction here in the reward system.
Well, and one of the things, Amy, that you describe in Right Kind of Wrong are these 3 archetypes of failure. So basic failure, complex failure, intelligent failure. And can you explain what each of these are and why you think it's helpful to distinguish in that way?
Well, I think it's helpful to distinguish them because without good distinctions, then people have this kind of double speak going on where people are saying, yeah, failure is good, they know, well, wait a minute, it's not good to be sloppy, or it's not good to, hurt people when you didn't have to, right? And they're right. So I think the distinctions, which are, of course, cognitive or intellectual, are step one toward helping us actually embrace the good kind, the right kind of wrong. So, and the right kind of wrong is the intelligent failure. And the definitional criteria that I offer are that it takes place in new territory. There's just no way to get the answer other than by trying something, by experimenting. It's in pursuit of a goal that seems worthwhile to you, whether that's, a new drug or new technology or a life partner, right? It's a goal. And you've done enough homework to have a reasonable hypothesis. You don't just act randomly. You're testing some thought about this might work. And finally, it's as small as possible, right? It's not wasting resources unnecessarily. It's the right size with which to learn. And then I do say, there's a bonus criterion, which is you take the time to learn from it. Then that makes it intelligent. And so you could just say, Amy, you just described discoveries. That's right. I did. It's a discovery, kind of a negative discovery rather than a positive discovery. But that's okay. It's a discovery. So we can see why it's valuable, and, we got to learn to love it.
And does that actually relate to what you were just sharing about that scientific mindset of we learned, I'm the only one who knows now what doesn't work for this example?
Yeah. Right. So even in your life, you might pick up a new sport or make a new friend, and you're learning. It's not new to the world, but you're learning something that's important to you. And so without appreciating how that really is valuable knowledge to your life, to your job, to your project, that you couldn't have gotten any other way, but trying something, then you're, it's easier to be okay with it. And then the other 2, basic and complex, are different in every way, but they're also different in that I think there's really no occasion I can think of where you should be happy about either kind, right? Some of them aren't very important, right? They could be trivial, you trip on the sidewalk, who cares, right? But a basic failure is a single cause failure, right? It's usually human error. That you made a mistake, you dropped your cell phone in the swimming pool and doesn't work anymore. It's a basic failure, and no need for celebration of that, right? It was avoidable. I mean, again, no need to beat yourself up either, right? Just pick it up, learn from it, don't do it again, move on.
But like basic failures are the kinds of things that a checklist can prevent. That's the way I think about it.
Yeah, actually, it's important. It's an important point because basic failures occur in known territory, as opposed to unknown, unfamiliar territory, which means that in order for something to be a basic failure, there has to have been existing knowledge about how to get the result you wanted, whether that's, baking cookies or remembering to plug in your phone before that important meeting, what have you, right? So it's just the knowledge existed, you followed it. Checklists can help, recipes can help, failure proofing techniques can help of all kinds. So that's the basic kind. And then the third kind, complex failures, are multi-causal. They're the failures that are caused by a number of different factors, none of which on their own would have led to the failure, but the very fact of their lining up at the same time in the wrong way led to a failure.
So like, is Chernobyl an example of a complex failure?
Yes. And Boeing 737 MAX is an example of a complex failure. A complex combination of competitive forces and incentives and geographic distance and technology and software all come, if you take any one of those factors out, you might have been in a position where you didn't come up with that exact design.
So better systems might prevent complex failures.
Yeah, and psychological safety can help prevent complex failures, because more often than not, at least many complex failures, and many of the ones I write about in the book, many of the ones I've studied, have the following in common. They could have been prevented had someone spoken up earlier with a concern or an observation, because that's all you need sometimes to catch and correct one of those factors. So the silver lining on complex failures is that, they're a mess, they're on the rise. But the silver lining is they give you all these different possibilities for catching and preventing.
So like command and control kind of companies are more likely to have complex failures, I would argue, than ones where people are more empowered.
That's right. And in fact, I study and write about a couple of them. Complex failure that happened at NASA in the shuttle program, the Columbia shuttle failure, was really the result of a command and control type organization at that time with a very complex system that was being managed. And that's a bad combination, right? You could make an argument that command and control work for the simplest, most modular, most divide and conquer kinds of activities. But when you start having complex technology and multiple disciplines who must work together and figure things out together, it can be quite problematic.
So are you saying not only would command and control environments lead to more complex failures, are they also inhibiting the intelligent failures or not celebrating the intelligent failures?
Generally, because if we may be overgeneralizing, but generally command and control organizations don't have a lot of reward systems in place for the intelligent failures, the discoveries of things that don't work. In other words, it's so much better to just not take risks, right? Do what you're told, stay in your lane, you'll be fine around here. And in order to have intelligent failures, you have to have people willing to take smart risks.
Do you have a story of an intelligent failure you like to share?
So here's my own intelligent failure that I actually opened the book with. My hypothesis, I was part of a large study of medication errors. And my simple hypothesis was that better teams with better measured teamwork would have fewer medication errors. Makes sense, right? But what the data suggested was that the better teams had higher rates of medication error. I mean, it just was a pretty straightforward correlation, and that didn't make any sense. And so what occurred to me was that maybe there were reporting differences, sort of differences, dramatic differences even, in people's willingness to speak up about error. What this means is, I'm not sure the hypothesis was wrong, but it was unprovable. unless you had a valid measure of error rates. So I think what I discovered was getting a valid measure of error rates. When error rates rely on human beings to kind of make them known to other human beings is not an easy thing. Now, that's also obvious,
Right.
but what was not obvious was that you'd have some groups that had no problem doing it and other groups that had real problems doing it, right? And that's what made me start to think about psychological safety, that you could be working in the same organization but have very different norms about talking about something as fraught as mistakes. And that struck me as interesting. That failure led me into a much more interesting research question than the original question.
I love that so much. And I don't know if you're able to pinpoint it or reflect on it, but when you first going back to Kim's original sort of surprise around, people's reactions to the data not necessarily panning out, when you first got the data that seemed counterintuitive, was there something that you think enabled you to posit that other possibility? That, I'm just curious if you actually kind of double click into what was happening inside you, that you actually were able to look at it from a different perspective.
Well, I think I was so afraid of telling my advisor that it hadn't worked. I mean, I think I was so genuinely not psychologically safe that I just sat there like, paralyzed at first. And then I thought, okay, now let's think about this, right? Let's take a little time to think about what might really be going on, because it can't be the case that better teams, more coordination, better quality relationships are simply sloppy. I mean, it just didn't, I guess it's possible, but it didn't seem right to me, given the little I knew about patient care. So I think it was just that, fear of speaking up about it led me to think before speaking, which may not be the right lesson to take away.
Yeah.
I think it's okay. I think that was a good there's good failure and there's good fear, and there's bad failure and bad fear.
True.
Well, you have so many wonderful stories in the book, in Right Kind of Wrong. And there was some of the research that you were pointing to, I thought it really leapt out at me. And I thought our listeners who are really dialed into the value of feedback would love to hear your reflections on. There was a hypothesis that failure, rather than promoting learning, actually undermines it. And this idea that success feedback is more effective than failure feedback in helping people learn, because failure is threatening to our egos. And so I'm curious, what lessons from the research that you've observed that could help guide our listeners on giving and receiving feedback at work.
Yes, well, this was these wonderful papers, and we can probably link to them, that were done. That set people up in a laboratory to do a task and then to get feedback on the task. And they would either get failure feedback or success feedback. And the failure feedback, they were told, what they got wrong, what they did wrong, and then they were given a sort of another similar task. And, it turns out they just didn't do better, right? They struggled to learn from the failure feedback, and they were happier learning from the success feedback. And the researchers hypothesized that this was, in part because of the sort of just simple aversion to failure. We don't like to fail, so that we just don't want to dig into it. Like we just really we'd rather move on and not think it through. And also a little bit about, the embarrassment of it, and that we just don't like that experience. So they did a number of experiments where they just sort of keep reproducing this inability to learn from failure. And then they did one that I think is really interesting, where they had people observe others do the same kinds of tasks. And then they were perfectly able to learn from other people's failures. So once we take the emotional, challenge out of it, then they're fine. But I don't think it's the right conclusion to say we can't learn from failure. I think the right conclusion is that it can be hard for us to learn from failure. But when we destigmatize it and try to cool down the hot emotions that it evokes by explaining, that this is sort of part of being a human being alive on this earth, is that you will experience failures. and they are, useful, and especially the right kind of wrong. The intelligent failures in new territory are precious. They're invaluable for you. So I think really the important question is, how do we help people grapple with the inherent pain of failure so that they can learn, rather than to walk away and say, people can't learn from failure, because of course we can.
Yeah, it's harder, which is why it's important to give more praise and criticism. It's why, not that managing people is like house training a dog, but like when you train a dog not to poop in your house, you're much better off saying, good job, when they go in the right place. If you rub their nose in it, they're going to poop behind the couch where you can't find it. And that's the worst of all worlds.
Exactly.
That's not data driven, but
yeah, well, I bet it is. But there is psychological finding. I mean, it's sort of robust in so many ways that bad is stronger than good. We're more upset by the bad feedback than we are happy about the good feedback.
So speaking of our negativity bias, one of the things I found really interesting was how you dedicate your last chapter to this idea of, us as fallible human beings, and how we can really, I think, to what you're just sharing, how can we embrace that so we keep learning? And I personally am really touched by how both you and Kim embrace your own fallibility. You have these breakthrough books that have really changed the scope of business and beyond. And yet you both acknowledge that you could do more, or could have done more, with regard to inclusion and belonging and representation. And so I just wanted to give you a moment to just each of you share your own experiences with that type of, first of all, how might you characterize that type of failure, Amy, and then any lessons that you and Kim have on sort of what you've learned from those experiences.
So one of the things that happened shortly after Radical Candor came out is I was giving a Radical Candor talk at a company in San Francisco, and the CEO of that company had been a colleague of mine for the better part of a decade, a person I like and respect enormously. And when I finished giving the talk, she pulled me aside, and she's one of too few Black women CEOs in tech or any other sector. And she said, Kim, it's a lot easier for you to roll out Radical Candor than it is for me. And she explained to me the difficulty that she had both giving and receiving feedback. When she would offer people even the most gentle, compassionate criticism, she would get slammed with the angry Black woman stereotype. And often when she was receiving feedback, it was not really feedback, it was bias or prejudice or bullying. And I realized that I hadn't given nearly enough thought in Radical Candor to how I might be putting people in a jam when they were rolling out the ideas. And that's what really prompted me to write my next book, which I called Just Work. And speaking of failure, I would say the title of Just Work just didn't work. And so we're going to call it Radical Respect when it comes out in paperback. So those are just a couple of examples from my experience.
Yeah, my own experience since the beginning of the COVID-19 pandemic, and likely before, I have moved from being unaware of my own unawareness to aware of my own awareness.
Yeah.
Right. Which is, it's a step in the right direction. Unawareness of what? Well, unawareness of what I call in the book the unequal license to fail. Right. That it's one thing to have a lot of, happy talk for entrepreneurs in Silicon Valley or innovators in companies, scientists, but more broadly, and thinking about our lives in our communities and in society, there can be no doubt that we do not all share the equal license to fail and then pick up the pieces and pivot and go on to the next step. Especially as, for example, when someone is worried about their failure being something that will influence people's perceptions of their whole group. Let's say your female Black CEO is ever so much more under pressure to do well, because if she fails in her role, she knows there will not be many behind her in that role, in that sector. That alone makes it so much harder to take the kinds of healthy risks that are necessary for success, in any field. So the takeaway now, where I am on this, is we have to do more discussion about how we have fallible human beings, but we also have a very fallible society. It's a society that is not yet well set up for equal permission to fail, for example, or equal anything for that matter. And so we have to take that as a given, right? If that's the given, now how do we fix it? That becomes the conversation, not just let's throw our hands up and say, oh, well, it can't be done.
Yeah, and I think I remember when I was graduating from business school, thinking that I had the world's best safety net underneath me now, and so that made it way easier for me to take swings that I wouldn't, because I could get other jobs. I would be. Remember, I did a startup that failed, and it failed just before a business school reunion, and I was kind of dreading going back to business school, thinking, all these people so successful, and my startup just failed, and everybody was like, "Oh, Kim, this is awesome! You failed, like you did this great thing." And I remember thinking, "Gosh, it's really nice, but it's also like that is an advantage. It's an example of a privilege that should be extended to everyone."
Just to go back to something that you were reflecting on, Amy, around with the pandemic and sort of unaware of unaware, and then some awareness of unawareness. You also spend time in Right Kind of Wrong exploring self-awareness, situation awareness, system awareness. And I just wanted to, especially since we're just talking about equity and systems, why is these sort of awareness zones? Help us understand a little bit more about why you think that was so important to make such a big part of the book.
I think that sort of failing well, which is really, again, preventing the preventable ones and being willing to take risks in one's life and work, can't be easily done without self-awareness to understand the role you and your consciousness and your thinking, really the role your thinking is playing in what you do and how you hold yourself back. Right? So it's self-awareness is especially about just recognizing, we talked about becoming aware of your unawareness, becoming aware of your unawareness so that you can take better risks. Like you can realize that a lot of your fears are blown up bigger than they need to be, that you'll really be fine if you make a misstep over here. You'll be able to, learn and go over here instead. But the overarching reason why self-awareness is important is that all of us will spontaneously choose knowing over learning. That just happens automatically. Like, I believe I see reality. I want to be right. And that error makes us averse to risk taking, but also it makes us incurious. And you can't practice the science of failing well unless you're curious, right? Because you've got to be curious about the world around you. You got to be curious about the people you meet. You've got to ask them good questions so that you can learn and develop your understanding and build good relationships and all of that, right? So it starts with me, right? That was a sort of recognition I had. And I thought, I better tackle this. I better sort of understand our role as individuals in contributing both to risk aversion and also to preventable failures. And then the next awareness zone that I talk about is context, which of course is so important because context is everything. If you're in a very risky, dangerous, air traffic control kind of setting, your job is to be absolutely cautious, to make sure people are safe speaking. This is a place where getting it right is critical. So it's that kind of environment, and you behave a certain way accordingly. If you're in a laboratory and you're risk averse, you're blowing it, right? You're supposed to be experimenting and being, really going wild. And I know that's simplistic, but I've seen both kinds of errors in my research. I've seen people being sort of overly cautious and risk averse in a sort of a situation that calls for playfulness. And then I've seen people being overly casual and not vigilant enough in a very risky, dangerous setting, right? So you want to sort of start with, okay, what's the uncertainty? What are the stakes? And act accordingly. And then finally, and very quickly, I think system awareness is just that discipline to move from the here and now, which is natural for us, to the later and elsewhere. Who else will be impacted? What feedback loops might there be? And that's mostly about preventing failures that we could prevent with a little bit of foresight, and also about creating the conditions for innovation, that really helps people do the things they need to do to fail well and innovate.
Yeah. So, like, as an example, I know I'm self-aware. I'm sloppy. I make sloppy mistakes. Like, I try not to. Maybe this is not very good, but this is like core to who I am. So I would never take a job in air traffic control. I remember my teacher I had. I was like, oh, it's no big deal. I just moved the decimal over, but I really understand the problem. And she said, what if you're a doctor? And I'm like, oh, I better not become a doctor because I'm going to still make that. Is that what you mean? Like, be aware of what the systems are. Like, I'm not going to become an airline pilot because I won't go through the checklist.
That's like where self-awareness and situation awareness come together. It's if you have a lot of self-awareness about your strengths, you might say, well, they don't include exactitude, so I'm not going over there. They do include, right? So yeah.
Am I mistaken? There was a story you shared about your son's, was it baseball practice and sort of the system interdependencies there? That was an example of system awareness.
Yes, very small example. But so my son.
I think people can relate to it.
Yeah, you bet. My older son, maybe some of our listeners have been there. Asked one summer whether he could join, the summer baseball league in addition to all of the other activities, of course, that were going on, and he seemed excited about it. And of course, it's possible. So, what's the natural response of the mother? Is there's this child looking eager. Natural response is yes, of course. But a tiny bit of thought I'm not saying this was the wrong answer, but that simple yes led to a sort of lack of family dinners for about the next 2 months, meaning that all the baseball, they were every single night. They were always at 6 p.m. That meant, a lot of driving and a lot of time. And it was summer, so a lot of time taken away from the family activities that could have been differently. Of course, it had an impact on the other son. And again, I'm not saying it was bad, but it's the kind of decision that should have been made thoughtfully. Like, it could be a yes, but it'll look like that, or it could be a no, which will look like that. But our natural tendency is very much in that moment, take the easy and happy answer, and not think through the interrelationships that are involved.
I love that story because I've made the exact same mistake. In fact, I'm leaving as soon as we hang up. I'm taking my son to go to batting practice. And we're in this beautiful place and we could be at the beach, but no, we're going to some mall and hitting the baseball.
Well, before we move on to practice, just want to share a moment and acknowledge what wonderful storytellers you both are. And Amy, I think one of your gifts of this blend of research and storytelling. And I'm just so curious, as you wrote the book, Right Kind of Wrong, was there anything that leapt out at you as a surprise of where you landed, now as the book is coming out?
But I think the surprise, I'm not sure if this is good enough surprise, but the surprise to me.
Any surprise is welcome.
Well, I wrote an article about failure 10 years ago, and I think the surprise to me was how much more I still had to learn about it and how much more I could learn from exploring the stories, some of which are from my life, but most of which, of course, are not. So I got to dig into all sorts of crazy stories, from the creation of a champagne industry to, the tragic crash of a boat, oil carrying boat, right? And in all of those all of that extra research, I learned so much more. It became so much more nuanced, but I also think more practical. So I guess the surprise was how much more there was to learn, both for me and I hope for my readers.
Before we close, I've called myself a recovering perfectionist. Is there any tip that you would have for me or for people who are listening like me who see themselves as having slightly perfectionist tendencies?
Perfectionist tendencies create pain, not joy. So remind yourself you are not unique in being a fallible human being, but you are a fallible human being. We all are. And that's okay. We were put on this earth with a right foot and a left foot for a reason, right? Not a wheel. We're not on a wheel going straight toward the goal. We're just going this way and that way until we get there. Built to trip, exactly. It's like, I think perfectionism, like being perfect, sounds like more fun than I think it really is.
Such wonderful words to live by. Before we close, I also have to acknowledge one of our Radical Candor coaches, Aaron Dimmick, who you interviewed in the book.
I did. I loved that interview. He told a great story of a failure in the sky in a training mission that was thankfully caught and corrected by great teamwork and great leadership on the part of Aaron.
Yeah, wonderful. Kim, anything more for Amy before we close?
No, thank you. Just a huge thank you. I always love our conversations, and I'm so glad that we could share this conversation with all the listeners.
As am I.
Well, thank you also, Amy. This has been such a pleasure. And go over to radicalcandor.com/podcast for the show notes for this episode. Don't forget to order this week's, and not just this week's favorite thing, I suspect this is going to be a perennial favorite, Amy's new book, Right Kind of Wrong, The Science of Failing Well. Available everywhere books are sold. Go out and get it for your friends, get it for your boss, get it for your colleagues. And again, praise in public and private, criticize in private. If you like what you hear, please do rate and review us on Apple Podcasts. And if you've got criticism for us, email it, podcast@radicalcandor.com.
We will reward the candor. Bye for now.
We will embrace our right kinds of wrong.
Yes.
Yes, we will. Bye for now. The Radical Candor podcast is based on the book Radical Candor, Be a Kick-Ass Boss Without Losing Your Humanity by Kim Scott. Episodes are written and produced by Brandy Neal with script editing by me, Amy Sandler. The show features Radical Candor co-founders Kim Scott and Jason Rosoff and is hosted by me, still Amy Sandler. Nick Carissimi is our audio engineer. The Radical Candor podcast theme music was composed by Cliff Goldmacher. Follow us on LinkedIn, Radical Candor the company, and visit us at radicalcandor.com.